So I name Kuper's seeming position pluralism. And as I read him, his sort of view is that individuals, governmental institutions, and the institutions of private enterprise are going to act as agents within his ethical theory. No group is going to play an exclusive primary role. However, he is going to assign greater priority to governmental and private institutions. And the roles of each class of agency may vary in significance from one context to the next, so that their choices have to be coordinated. Their actions have to be coordinated, and that will be a component of the evaluation of those choices and actions in the theory itself. The final set of distinctions that we're going to want to keep in mind now are distinctions between political philosophies, right? Theories about how society should be structured. And the two traditional candidates, or relatively traditional candidates, that he looks at are neoliberalism and socialism. And then he articulates the outline, at least, of an alternative approach that he doesn't name, and so I name for him, I call it contextual judgment. So the first political ideology that we want to look at is neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is a sort of revival of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism was a political ideology of the 19th century, and it espoused the rule of law, prioritized high levels of civil liberties, and most particularly emphasized economic freedoms. Neoliberalism is a sort of resurgence of liberalism in the 20th century. It, too, advocates rule of law and high levels of civil liberty. But the advocates of neoliberalism also aggressively argue for increasing the role of private enterprise throughout society through the privatization of government agencies, through deregulation, through free trade, and through significant reductions in government spending. At the opposite end of the spectrum of political ideologies, well, not complete end, but is socialism. And socialism, in contrast to liberalism, rose to prominence as a political ideology in the late 18th century and continued to gain prominence well into the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. And it was driven primarily by a perceived excess and inefficiency in capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism as it was practiced up until that time. And so it was an ideological response to these perceived excesses and inefficiencies. Now, socialism has a lot of different variations. There isn't just one doctrine, socialism. But in general, socialism seeks to decrease the role of private enterprise through some form of public or collective ownership of certain usually important or key types of enterprises. So, for example, socialized medicine seeks to provide health care. There's a particular enterprise, and it seeks to do it through governmental institutions or through government regulations of private or collective institutions, so that there's a strong public component to it, either through direct ownership or through regulation of private ownership, so that there's a lot of public control of this particular area. Now, Kuper doesn't seem to embrace either of these views. He seems to articulate a sort of framework for political ideology that's somewhat different. And so I give it a name. I call it contextual judgment. It's not a full-blown political ideology. It's a sort of framework, a set of priorities for setting priorities, really. So he doesn't advocate any specific doctrine in the paper. But he does indicate three components, that is, three lines of analysis that are important to formulating and evaluating any policies in his view within this sort of framework of contextualized judgment. And in fact, he's going to use this general framework to criticize Singer's position. And his criticism is going to be largely on the grounds that Singer's view, the people in affluent countries should be making substantial donations, large portions of their discretionary income, right? That view doesn't constitute a theoretically sophisticated and potentially effective long-term strategy to alleviate extreme poverty or any social ill, really. And he goes so far as to suggest that it might actually even harm the people it's intended to help, this sort of policy of substantial donation. And so his criticism of Singer's is in fact going to be that Singer's a man with a hammer. He's running around the world with a hammer, but there are very few nails in the world. And so this is a blunt instrument that has very few uses, and Singer is trying to use it on everything. So when we look at this criticism, right, the criticism isn't necessarily with the degree of responsibility or obligation or allocation of resources. It's how those resources are supposed to be deployed that Kuper takes issue with here. And so when we look at how Singer might respond to Kuper's view, we'll want to look at whether or not Singer's view provides us with any basis for responding to this kind of criticism, or if Kuper is correct in supposing that this is an important aspect that Singer doesn't address, and insofar as he doesn't address it, his view is defective. So let's go back and look at those three components, those three elements of analysis for any policy proposal that Kuper thinks we want to make. So the first element of analysis that he thinks we really need, the first bit of knowledge that we need to apply in formulating and evaluating policies is, and this is a quote from page 114, a political economy that charts the causal dynamics of global economy and indicates the extent to which these could be controlled. Okay? So there's our first line of analysis. There's our first knowledge about the world that we need to bring to bear in formulating and evaluating policies. The second is a theory of justice that supplies a metric for evaluating goals and derives a set of principles with which to approach problems of development. And the third line of analysis, the third body of knowledge that we need to bring to bear in formulating and evaluating policies, is a political sociology that encompasses and distinguishes the respective roles of individuals and various institutions in advancing those moral ends. So these three bodies of knowledge, these three dimensions of analysis, are at the heart of what he considers to be judgment, which is effective policy making that's going to have long-term stable influence on correcting these kinds of social ills.